Okay, hi everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll start with introductions while people are funneling in before we get started with this talk. My name is Carolyn Glasser, and I am the current chair of the Animals and Society section of the ASA. We are one of the hosts of the Animals and Society Colloquium series. Our other host is the Animals and Society Institute, and Ivy Collier is with us today representing them. She's the executive director. Up in the chat, I put some links. I put the link to the resource page of the ASA Animals and Society section where you can later find a recording of this talk. And I put up a link to ASI. ASI is a wonderful organization and anyone can join and become part of their newsletter. So I really encourage you to click on that link if you're not already part of their network and join up and stay up to date with all sorts of animals and society stuff. If you are a sociologist and you're not currently a member of the Animals and Society section of the ASA, I would love it if you reached out to me so that we can tell you more about the group and hopefully get you more involved. So let's talk about what we're really here for today, and that is our wonderful presentation. Today, our presentation is called Responsible Anthropomorphism in Children's Books, from Classic Examples to New Proposals. This talk is being given by Melissa Jacobi and Ginny Vermilya. Melissa Jacobi currently works with the National Park Service in the Financial Assistance Department. She received a master's degree in internal affairs from Denver University and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Colorado at Denver. As an artist, flora and fauna inspire her work. She utilizes whimsical line work to capture the essence of creatures and place them in narrative environment. She works as a traditional illustrator, primarily with, Jenny, I'm not sure how to say this, Melissa.
Melissa.
Gouache.
Yeah, squash.
Oh, you're going to have to tell us what that is. Watercolor, pen, and ink. Dr. Ginny Vermilya currently works as an assistant professor in the clinical teaching track in the sociology department at the University of Colorado at Denver. She received a PhD in sociology from the University of Colorado Boulder. She specializes in animals and society, gender, symbolic interactionism, and qualitative methods. And she's researched non-human animals across various social institutions, including veterinary education and policing. I had to read all that because it was just way too much to remember and too varied. And that's what I love about this colloquium series. We're bringing you things with people from all different fields collaborating and working together. And I'm so excited for this talk. So with that, I'm going to make a couple announcements and then hand it over. This is in a webinar format, which means we have two features. We have a chat feature and we have a Q&A feature. If you have a question for the speakers, type it in the Q&A feature and I'll be moderating that. We're generally going to let the speakers talk for the first part of the event. But if there's a very timely question that pops up, I may interrupt and ask them. Otherwise, we'll wait till the Q&A feature. And then you can also use the chat to talk to each other and to let the speakers know a little bit about yourself. So one great way to get started might be if all of you just type in what your affiliation is and what you do so that our speakers during the Q&A can glance at that and know a little bit about who do we have here? Do we have artists? Do we have academics? Do we just have a generally interested audience? So go ahead and type that in the chat while we get started. And this is being recorded. So if you don't want your name mentioned at all, I wouldn't put anything in the chat, but you are not visible if you are in the audience on camera, so you don't have to worry about being shown on camera. Okay, and with that, we will get to what we're here for, our wonderful talk by Melissa Jacobi and Ginny Vermilya. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I love that you had to ask how to pronounce an artistic term, because that really just, I think, symbolizes the heart of this project. Melissa and I are constantly learning from one another because we do come from very different worlds. So I'm Jenny. I'm the sociologist of our collaborative project. And I first want to start off with just thanking the colloquium for hosting us today. So the Animals and Society section of the ASA and the Animals and Society Institute. Let's see if my slides are working. There we go. I'm going to kick it off to Melissa. She's going to tell a little bit more about the project backstory and the origin story of how it all started with her.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for joining us. So the origin of this project began with my Bachelor of Fine Arts illustration thesis project. I wanted to create a children's picture book with a memorable character. I love drawing animals, so I was interested in the concept of anthropomorphism in children's books. Animals and anthropomorphism is a prevalent theme in children's books, so I set out to find a how-to guide on illustrating an anthropomorphic character. There was not a lot of material out there, so I applied for a research grant to do my own investigation. Through this grant project, I found there was some criticism of anthropomorphism, and so I pondered if there was a way to modernize this art form. The prevalent theme was that anthropomorphism was a bit outdated. While it is and was found in many picture books, some considered it as something to be avoided. Bound and determined to create the best picture book I could, I continued to explore the idea that I could do it well. As a result of my research project, I came up with an initial formula on how to develop a children's book character and why it was important. At the project conclusion, I wondered if there was a way in which artists could respond to the criticism of anthropomorphism and create characters in a new way. This led to my fellowship project, in which I explored ways to redefine anthropomorphism from a visual perspective. And then through this fellowship project, my collaboration with Jenny began. So I'll kick it back over to Jenny, and she's gonna pick apart some of the sociological analysis of this. So go ahead, thanks.
So yeah, what Melissa said when I came on board with the project was Melissa was already kind of giving presentations on her ideas as an art student. And it really resonated with some of the work that I was doing in the world of animals and society and sociology. So what I love most about this project is it truly is an interdisciplinary collaboration. We come from different worlds, and again, we are constantly learning from one another. So kind of what I would like folks to take from this talk, if anything they take, is, start talking to people who are in different worlds from you, because we have found such value in doing that ourselves, and just kind of getting out of your comfort zone of the world that you exist in. So for us, this is a collaboration between fine arts and sociology, but we're also having conversation and kind of expanding the project into discussions with thinking about biological perspectives and other scientists and their perspectives on animal experiences as well. The other thing I like about this project that I just wanted to call out is it truly is an applied research endeavor. The goal is to, create children's books that perhaps look a little different, or at least kind of are starting to have a different conversation in their depictions with animals. So what one criticism that could be for, academic circles is we're really good at kind of breaking down and analyzing pieces of culture, and then we don't go on and replace those pieces of culture or try and kind of move the line forward of how could we maybe do something that incorporates some of the research that we find. And I think that's what this project is really aiming to do, is let's not just critique what has been done and what is, but let's also think about what could be and actually produce that as a creative project. What I want to talk about today is this concept that we've developed and we continue to refine called responsible anthropomorphism. So as I go through kind of the analytics of it, we'll talk about how did we come to define what this is, and then Melissa will kind of end the project with, here are some examples of what that might actually look like in practice. So I'm going to do the kind of academic part of, let me walk you through the literature. If you're not already familiar with the literature out there on children's picture books, non-human animals, and anthropomorphism. If you dive into this literature, which many of you probably have as sociologists or other animal studies scholars, again, I'm going to assume that the audience is really a mixed audience, that I'm hoping there are academics out there, I'm hoping there are artists out there, I'm hoping there are people who take care of children or teach children out there. So I like that we have this mixed audience. So just to get everyone kind of on the same page with what have academics kind of found and critiqued about anthropomorphism, is really just that you are going to find a lot of criticism about how it has been done. But again, what we're trying to do is maybe how could we take that criticism and do something that's maybe a little bit better. So I'm going to break it down into a few different categories of critiques and provide at least some, examples of scholars that have dived into those critiques. This is not a comprehensive list of all the criticisms that are out there, but it just helps us get the conversation going of what are we talking about when we're saying that anthropomorphism is largely criticized. So a first area of criticism centers on the fact that using non-human animals in art forms, in children's picture books specifically, that it really creates this human-centered worldview, right? It's a very anthropocentric, we're interested in humans, it's for humans, it's about humans essentially, but we're using animals, in their form to tell these stories. What this can do, some scholars have found, is that it can give children inaccurate information about non-human animals. So as we'll talk about kind of our attention to things like form and expression, this is one way to combat this criticism, where you are really trying to pay attention to how can we teach children more accurate information about how these animals live and move about in the world. So if you're interested in learning more about any of those sorts of criticisms, here are some scholars that look at that. Another area is an interest in place. So where are these animals and how do we find them? How are they showing up in these stories? And a lot of criticism, rightfully so, is critiquing the fact that we often disconnect animals from their actual natural environments, that animals almost serve as a placeholder for any other character or even any other object. They're used in these stories, but they're not necessarily placed in a setting that might accurately portray how their lives actually look. So again, a nice scholar that you can look at if interested in that. And the third kind of area of criticism that we wanted to focus on is that, we have an idea, at least we have this kind of cultural narrative, this discourse that we might use animals to teach kids moral lessons, and that using animals might actually be better at teaching moral lessons to children. And so pro-social behaviors like teaching kids about fairness and equality and being a kind, good citizen, right? That these are the things that we think we might be doing when we're using animals in children's picture books. And a lot of research actually shows that might not be happening, at least not to the extent that we think it might be happening. And actually human characters in those stories might actually teach some of those lessons a bit better. So if you're interested, here are some scholars. Now, it's important to note, as I'm kind of walking through these criticisms, that it's not all critical information out there. Some of it is a bit of a mixed review. So there is some dispute of whether or not anthropomorphism can positively affect these pro-social behaviors and well teach these children these values or not. So it is important to note that there does seem to be some value in using anthropomorphism, and that's kind of what leads us to our project idea. Not just the idea that artists might want to use animals in their work, but also that animals might be doing something good for us, and if we could do something good for them, right? Our whole premise is how can we maybe think about anthropomorphism in a different way instead of just throwing it out completely. So what did we do, right? When Melissa kind of started with these ideas and she kind of started on creating some of her stories and her artwork for her books, as she'll talk about later, I kind of jumped on board and was really interested in just kind of thinking about this as an analytical project, right? How can I use sociology to try and make sense of what she's attempting to do as an artist? So for me, I'm a qualitative researcher and I have experience doing content analyses. And I thought a really good way to maybe dive into this is how has anthropomorphism either worked or not worked before? We ended up settling on doing a case study of 3 different classic children's illustrated books. So we picked them intentionally, right? We really wanted these to be books that were recognizable, authors, illustrators that were recognizable. We wanted them to kind of almost mark childhood for us, that if we saw them, we would, recall memories of being read these stories, that really these are stories that kind of got ingrained in our cultural imagination. But we also picked the 3 different case studies for their differences. As I'll walk through the 3 case studies, you'll see they do not at all look the same. The illustrations in these books don't depict animals in a similar way. They're not using the same artistic style methods, and the stories are not the same either. So we wanted to kind of get a good range of what are the stories that are out there and how are each of them using anthropomorphism. So I'm going to walk through the 3 cases kind of quickly, just to kind of give you a sense of what we're examining and what we've been thinking. The first, I'm guessing, is perhaps already a recognizable name, Beatrix Potter. And if you don't know Beatrix Potter, surely you know her most famous character of Peter Rabbit. So in thinking about a character, and Melissa and I talk about this all the time, and Melissa will always note she's so stunned of how this character has survived this length of time, and what is it about kind of creating this lasting non-human animal character that really has stood the test of time. In thinking about what is Potter doing with anthropomorphism, we can kind of use art and also use social science to kind of break down maybe what's happening here. So in thinking about naturalistic observation, Potter is pretty well known for actually looking at rabbits a lot, and kind of studying form and expression and how they move. Now that shows up in her illustrations, like for instance, look at Peter Rabbit. You have these realistic bodies to some extent. It's almost like it's a neck up, a head up, kind of realistic depiction, and then the rest of the body really not so much. So when you see part of the body as being really representative of how an actual rabbit looks, you see the head, the coloring, this attention to detail, but they're standing up at the same time. And they're really kind of their stature, their movements, and even their clothing, it's childlike. So a lot of ways that Potter is drawing these rabbits is in some sense realistic to a rabbit's true form. And in other ways, it's really kind of trying to resonate with this is how kids move about in the world. So she's not quite kind of attending to the full expression of the rabbits themselves, but she definitely is paying attention to actual rabbits in the world. Another thing that Potter's doing is kind of noting the behavior of actual rabbits. So this is where, again, it's a little bit realistic, a little bit not realistic. So realistic, right? She talks about foraging for rabbits. These are things that rabbits actually do with their time. So Peter Rabbit going into the garden, this is something that you would actually see a rabbit doing. Whereas unrealistic things, this is where you have anthropomorphic rituals such as a bedtime tuck-in, right? So it's not a full-on, accurate depiction of a real rabbit's life, but it's definitely some attention has been paid to try and represent some aspects of their lives in an accurate way. So that's one kind of case study that you can look at to see how has anthropomorphism played out. In what ways are we attending to it? In what ways are we maybe not attending to some of those critiques? A second case is Tommy Ungerer, and this one I like because it's so very different than Potter. So when you look at something like Rufus the Bat, which is a famous character from Ungerer, you see that the stylistic method that he's using is not the sort of method that Potter was using, right? He's not looking at bats, really. I mean, he might have been looking at bats, but he's not drawing them in this realistic way. It's really more of a cartoonish, stylistic method. But what Ungerer is doing that's really interesting is he's using story and narrative to tell something different about bats. So when we think about, for instance, bats as problem animals, right? And there's a lot of literature on animals that we define as a social problem, or we attach characteristics such as they're dangerous or scary or demonic, right? It produces lived consequences for those animals and how we think about them. So when thinking about Rufus the Bat, if you're unfamiliar with the story, right, Rufus is our protagonist. It's a really kind of lovely tale about, Rufus moving about in the world and discovering parts of the world that he didn't know about, such as the daytime and colors, and kind of falling in love with that. So you're rooting for Rufus, right? It's not that Rufus is a scary character. Unger also really pays attention to place and limits of place. Ultimately, he doesn't have Rufus just go and live in the daytime. Ultimately, Rufus goes back to his cave and realizes, that's nice out there, but I need to be here. I'm a nocturnal animal. So it's an attention to what are actual bats doing, right? We can't just pick them up and move them anywhere and have them do anything. So that was one way that we saw that Unger was maybe attending a little bit better to that sort of criticism. And the third case, I'll wrap it up with William Steig. So Steig, if you're unfamiliar, characters like Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, Amos and Boris. What Steig is doing is he's doing kind of this mixed stylized expression. So different from Potter, different from Unger. As you'll see in the image here with the donkeys, he has some realistic bodies and some kind of unrealistic bodies, right? Doing things that donkeys' bodies probably would not even be able to do, and some movements and forms that they absolutely could do. So it's definitely an attention to bodies and animal expressions. But in his storytelling, animals really are not the focus of the storytelling. It's not like Unger, where we're using a bat's lived experience to kind of craft this interesting story about what might a bat think about having an existential crisis about where he lives and not maybe wanting to live in this cave in the darkness. That's not the storytelling that Steig is doing. Steig is kind of telling kind of more, human existential crisis stories. How can we teach kids about friendship and loss and grief and even death? In thinking about kind of the animals in the story, it could be anybody in the story, that the story really is not about the animals and their lived experiences at all, right? They're just simply a placeholder. So in thinking about these three different cases, they're quite different, not just artistically, but in terms of narrative, in terms of kind of representation, in terms of the symbolic usage of animals. This is why we think that they're really interesting to look at for how can we craft this concept of responsible anthropomorphism. What might it look like? What do we want to pay attention to? What do we think matters as social scientists and as artists moving forward? So we kind of crafted this framework for, these are some lessons that can be learned from these classic studies. So the first and foremost pattern we wanted to call out is form and expression. So this is where you can understand the non-human animal. You really need to do that before attributing human characteristics. Whether or not you end up drawing an animal in its realistic form, right? At least attending to, how might that animal actually move about in the world? That felt like something that seemed to be important to attend to. This requires a study into form, movement, and structure. So something that would be incorporated into art training programs, right? That this is something to kind of pay attention to if you want to illustrate non-human animals. The next one is scene, that we felt, it really did seem to matter where you're placing the non-human animal, this environmental narrative and or experience for the character to interact and exist within, that mattered. Let's not just move them about like chess pieces anywhere and have them do anything, right? And again, how you attend to that and to what extent, that can vary. And the third is story. So are the non-human animals, are they a major focus of the story, right? Are they not a major focus of the story? If so, if they're a part of the story, is it teaching kids about their actual lived experiences in any way? So stories seem to really matter as well. And again, to what extent you're attending to that can vary. But this seemed to be the three kind of main things that we see in these classic cases of how some of these illustrators kind of attended well, or maybe didn't really attend to each of these things. But it's definitely a framework that we can use moving forward in thinking about how can we talk with artists and creators about anthropomorphism and maybe addressing some of those criticisms. So I'm going to now kick it over to Melissa, who's going to walk through some examples of her own of how does this actually look in real life. So how do we take this framework and we produce something with it? Again, this is the applied part of the project. Melissa?
Thank you, Jenny. So based on the research that Jenny just walked through, I had done for my illustration projects, I employed various aspects of previous author illustrators and took it a little further. I made I made conscientious choices regarding how to represent anthropomorphism in a more responsible way. For the illustrations of my Hound Dog and Frog book, which is pictured here, I studied the natural form and movements of dogs, much like how Beatrix Potter studied her rabbits for her Peter Rabbit character. So I put the hound in a den, since that is a place a hound dog would naturally go. And when adding in accoutrements to develop the hound character, I deviated a bit from Potter. In my story, the hound loves to read, so I wanted to show him carrying a stack of his most favorite books when he left his den. Instead of drawing the hound on hind legs with a backpack, I chose to create a book harness that would allow the hound to carry the books while he's on all four legs, as shown in this photo here. Of course, this is a completely imaginary situation, but I asked myself, if a dog could carry books, how would they do it differently than a human? This deviated from Potter in that Peter Rabbit is depicted standing more like a child than a rabbit. Peter Rabbit has a childlike body with a rabbit head. So I tried to deviate from this method by contemplating how a hound would naturally move, albeit in an imaginary world. So on the next slide, for my Wallace the Whale Goes to Wales book, I created a whale character who needs a vacation. So he decides to go to Wales. In this example, I focused the responsible anthropomorphism on the narrative scene and story. I portray a whale that is a businessman wearing a hat and carrying a briefcase, which of course is not a naturalistic form at all, but I thought about what would prompt a whale to take a vacation and why. So I imagined what kind of job would a whale do in its own environment. Whales travel long distances and they live in the ocean. So I created a whale character that was a traveling seashell salesman. His job is to travel all over the ocean, selling seashells to hermit crabs that have outgrown their shells and need new ones. This is similar to Tommy Unger's Rufus the Bat in that the scene involves contemplating the animal's ethology or animal behavior and ecology place. These scenes for the bat and the whale are completely imagined, but they pay homage to the natural worlds in which these animals live. For my third book, about the cognitive behavior of animals, the concepts explored in my previous two books are taken one step further. I interviewed scientists working with animals about their observations and advanced cognitive behavior in animals. I took their scientific narrative and I created anthropomorphic characters from them. I thought it would be an interesting idea to take the very thing that is criticized, anthropomorphism, to tell the story of animals instead of humans. I studied the form of the animals and their natural environment, but the story is based out of scientific observation of ethology and ecology. In this final example, I deviated from the example of William Steig in that I used anthropomorphism as a narrative tool or a bridge for humans to understand the animals in their world, rather than using animals to talk about our world. Traditionally, anthropomorphism is the act of placing human characteristics on a non-human creature or object. In this example of my third book, I took scientific facts and observations about a kangaroo rat and their natural agricultural techniques. Kangaroo rats dry grass by chewing it down with their teeth, placing it out in the sun to dry, and rolling it into haystacks to store underground for the winter to feed their families. This natural behavior reminded me of what humans have done as farmers. So I visually represented the kangaroo rat in overalls like a human farmer, but the kangaroo rat is not acting human. He is acting as he would in his natural environment. It is only the visual tool of anthropomorphism that is making the connection between human and non-human. This collaboration with Jenny has taken the foundation of my previous projects and launched into an analysis of how to be responsible with anthropomorphism. With these examples we have discussed with this presentation, we are essentially defining 3 types of responsible anthropomorphism: form, place, and narrative. There are possibilities to illustrate anthropomorphic characters with any or all 3 of these types of anthropomorphism. With this research, we hope to start a conversation about how to change anthropomorphism in children's picture books to meet a better standard, a more responsible standard that takes ecology and ethology into consideration. Because of this research and collaboration with Jenny as a sociologist, I have now become a different artist. As an artist, when I illustrate my anthropomorphic animals, I am thinking different thoughts now for creating my art. We can never fully understand what it's like to be a non-human animal, but we can do it better. We can at least try. Anthropomorphism has existed since we as humans have been drawing pictures on the walls of caves. This narrative tool is a part of us. The criticism of anthropomorphism is valid, but instead of just throwing it out and saying you can't use it, let us try to change it instead of destroying it. Let us think of a way in which we can use anthropomorphism responsibly. This technique can lead to a whole new perspective of animals and empathy for the ecosystems of our natural world, encouraging conservation and preservation with a new and revised art form. Art has the capability to initiate social change, presenting new imagery to the eyes of children, providing hope for the future. And with that, we'd like to conclude this presentation and open it up for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. So we are going to open it up to questions now. Right now, I don't have any questions in the Q&A, but there are some comments that may be worth addressing, some sort of, I think some tough comments to answer because it's for Lydia. Lydia, if you would like me to unmute you, I can have you speak, or if you'd like, I can try to summarize what you've said in the chat. Just go ahead and let me know what you prefer in the chat. Okay, I'll go ahead and summarize. So Lydia pointed out that the hound in the first illustration, and you can see some of these comments in the chat yourself while I talk, was wearing glasses, and sort of pointed out like, how is that different than Beatrix Potter's representation of a rabbit, and brought up that the dogs, that domesticated companion animal dogs, live in a different way than presented in the story. So I think that this gets at something about the lines. How do you decide these lines of how far you go with anthropomorphizing when you are using the animals to be in a human-like setting versus when you're anthropomorphizing them to explain who they are to humans? Right. Did that make sense the way I asked that?
Yeah, I may start, and then Melissa, you can piggyback as well. That was a great question, and that's something we thought about as we were developing this framework. And again, the goal is that it's a framework to start a conversation. And I think what we didn't mention as part of the project origin story, the backstory for kind of what ignited some of this with Melissa, was that she was in an art program and really wasn't getting those answers from professors or mentors that she was reaching out to. She was trying to figure out, right, how to illustrate animals, and warnings were presented to her of be careful, like not to avoid it completely, but to be careful because these criticisms may come your way with being anthropomorphic. And so she really was looking for this framework. And I think when we started our collaboration, we thought, let's use ideas that you have around illustrating animals, and let's try and create a framework not a framework to say this is how we completely avoid the critiques or not, but a framework to at least create and set the stage for some intentionality. And I think we had a discussion, we had dinner last night where we talked about that. That's what we feel the contribution maybe is that instead of just leaving it up to individual creative expressions through artists who absolutely have their right of creative freedom in what they illustrate, but to maybe have at least a foundational scholarly conversation that's evidence-based, that's maybe backing and supporting artistic decision-making. So if, for instance, we were to have a framework in like a class in art school, what might that look like if we wanted to kind of start a conversation about how do we illustrate non-human animals? And the reason we say this, that a framework is really needed and is missing, is because there are frameworks in art programs for how to illustrate and take into account things like gender or things like race. And so artists are definitely diving into social problems and grappling with inequality and oppression and trying to attend to those things in their artistic decision making. But what we don't see as much is that same conversation happening for non-human animal depictions. Now, again, that could be happening kind of sporadically throughout, but what we're trying to do is maybe making it a little bit more mainstream. And so that's kind of the goal of the project. So each of the points that we say of this is how to maybe attend to anthropomorphic critiques. It's not to say that you can't still draw a hound dog with glasses, right? You can't still draw a whimsical creature. Certainly you can, but if you have an intention that there are decisions that were being made around how to maybe do that, with taking the non-human animals' lived experience into account, we thought that it was at least worthwhile a framework to maybe be incorporated into some of those conversations between scholars and artists, which is kind of what we've done throughout our collaboration, right? We're constantly learning from one another. Melissa, did you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, that was a really great, succinct response to that. And I guess the only thing I would add is, I think what we're trying to create is just a more intentional imaginary world, if that makes sense. So, you know, of course, a dog, I mean, at least to my knowledge, doesn't know how to read. But I thought, you know, and just to give a little bit of a background on the creation of that character, it was based on my own dog, who he loved to nap in my library. And so like the idea sort of was generated through a personal experience that I had with my own pet. And I sort of would imagine that he was, you know, when I was away at work, he was writing up a, you know, dissertation on, you know, I don't know, milk bones or something. And so the framework is to not take all of the imagination away, but to, as an artist, to walk into that imaginary space with an intention of paying homage or respect to at least a few aspects of what an animal does in this world. And I guess to show how it would have probably no attention to that is if the dog were walking around holding a book and up on his hind legs and moving more like a person. So you can take certain aspects, and that decision making, I mean, that is where the creative licensing is. But what we're trying to say is that at least you can build a framework where you're thinking about the intention. And so the intentional purpose of myself saying, I'm not going to put the dog on hind legs. I'm going to make him move as an animal would move through the world naturally. That was my artistic interpretation of how can I create something that's whimsical and fun for a child, but also help them imagine how a dog could exist more naturally in our human world. That makes sense.
Thank you. So there's a lot of questions and stuff going on in the chat. So I'm going to try to sort of loop together some of these things. So Jacqueline pointed out something that I think Jenny might have spoken to a little bit in the beginning, that perhaps anthropomorphism could be good at some stage to help children understand things and develop empathy. And I think that goes along really well with a question that came from Greta about what research went into how children responded to what you view to be responsible versus irresponsible anthropomorphism, or have you even gotten to that stage yet?
Say the last part again, Carol.
So Greta wondered what research went into how children were responding to what you view to be the responsible versus irresponsible anthropomorphism. So maybe the hope would be the responsible anthropomorphism might get at what Jacqueline's saying, like maybe we could create empathy. What research went into that, or are you even at that stage yet?
Yeah, it really was when we dived into the literature, when I dived into the literature. I remember when I met Melissa, and she was telling me stories about, really being warned about being anthropomorphic from art professors. And I said, that really tracks with a lot of what I've read about kind of anthropomorphism can really be detrimental in a lot of ways. But when I started reading more up on it, the reviews are mixed, right? So there, I think it was Jacqueline made the point of, this can foster empathy in kids and using animals as a way to connect them to these stories. And that is valid, and research does support some of that. So when I mentioned in our very brief, review of the literature of, the kind of mixed reviews around some of those pro-social behaviors have been found to be really resonating for kids if they read books with animals. So that kind of started the heart of the framework, right? Is instead of maybe living in the world of the critiques only and maybe dismissing, this method, how could we maybe create a framework that doesn't provide answers for how do we do this, the best, right? But providing a conversation starter for maybe how to think about, moving that needle to a more intentional conversation. So I'm hesitant to use the language of, this is the right way or this is the wrong way to do it. And as I went through each of the case studies, hopefully what you were hearing was the analysis led us to see ways in which those illustrators were attending to some of those criticisms in some ways, and in other ways, maybe choosing to not attend. What we have discussed is that when a lot of artists emerge from artistic training, if they go on to something like an art program or art school, are they having those conversations in their classes? In the same way that they're having the conversations about how to depict female forms or male forms and thinking about things like gender, right? I think those conversations are certainly happening in those classes, and a little bit maybe less so in discussing non-human animals, which I think anyone who studies non-human animals it does always seem that that's kind of the next thing to follow is in our conversations where we really attend to a lot of inequality and oppression that exist in human circles. And then we're a little slower to kind of bring in non-human animals into that conversation. So I think that's really just what we're trying to do is let's provide a framework that, is still kind of in process, but it's something that can get that intentionality, that conversation to be maybe a part of the decision-making process, and to attend to the fact that research can be a little mixed on this, that maybe, using animals can actually do some really, really good positive things, such as foster some of that empathy for kids.
So, oh, sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, and that's it.
Oh, well, so you mentioned that you think maybe people are starting to have some of these conversations and you're envisioning that projects like this can help bring them more central, like it's a foundation that will make these conversations easier. Jennifer pointed out that your 3 case studies are from a little bit older books and wondered if you're seeing more recent examples that are already following this model that you're talking about. And can you remind us the 3 parts of this model that artists should be considering?
I'll put it back up on the screen.
I can only remember 2 of the 3, so I'm guessing some other people might have. So form and expression.
The form and expression, scene, and then story or narrative.
So have you seen any recent examples that you think are following this model?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did choose to do classic text. And the only reason we picked the classic ones is we were interested in that visibility piece. Like, for instance, are these the classic examples that art students are kind of presented with in art programs as like, hey, Beatrix Potter, right? And that does take some time to kind of gain that notoriety. I do think that's a good maybe next phase of the project of kind of examining more contemporary works. You know, these over the last kind of 100 years, I would say that these 3 kind of are spaced out as, you know, kind of covering some pretty significant moments and still kind of getting that label of it's a classic work. So it's something that's more likely to show up in, say, an art class. So we did choose our case studies intentionally, that we wanted them to be kind of recognizable, not just recognizable for an average audience of readers, but recognizable for an art professor to choose to teach them as a model in their classes. But yeah, I think that's a good next step for us to do, is see, you know, how is this changing, and is it changing? So I appreciate that. Thank you.
While you're talking about next steps, a couple people have brought up various things that have to do with language and narrative. Is that outside the scope of this project, or is that something that you are talking about? There's 2 different comments about the idea of language or narrative and how these characters are speaking as well.
Can you give me like the example of language? Or
I can read you one of the questions. What I found missing in the presentations is a similar discussion on the language used in children's non-human comics. I think that often the language has a higher impact on readers than the pictorial illustrations. And the question goes on, but that is really the heart of it. And someone else said, have you researched narrative empathy? Because it sounds like you share the same thesis with that concept.
I'll look into that. So thank you very much. No, we focused on illustration, so visual art form. And that's because Melissa was trained as an illustrator and was interested in decision-making around visual depictions of non-human animals. So that's where our work is centering on. But I completely agree that, you know, the storytelling is part of this as well. But yeah, I think for us, it was more, how are these things visually represented through the picture books, through the illustrations? Melissa, do you want to?
Well, and also, yeah, so this is limited to children's picture books. And so traditionally speaking, creating a picture book, the imagery and the narrative text should have almost an equal weight in the story. So if you do it well, which, I mean, I am 100% willing to admit my weaknesses as an illustrator and depicting this in the best way possible. I am still very much in the learning process of this, and I'm just trying to figure out how to do it well. And I know that, you know, the imagery should be able to say something on its own, and then the text as well. So the text and the imagery should should really be able to, so like you wouldn't be able to know the whole story without the text, and you wouldn't be able to know the whole story without the pictures. Of course, there are picture books that have no text, and then there's picture books that have very heavy text. But in my personal opinion, I think the best ones are the ones that are very complementary to each other. And I appreciate that comment, because I have not thought about the specific impact of language and responsible anthropomorphism just in the text. So my exploration was really solely based on the imagery representation of the animal and the scene of the imagery. So I appreciate that comment, because that's something to look into for sure.
So in the chat, this is not what your project is about, but I'm sure both of you have some ideas about it. In the chat, people have gotten excited about an idea that Ken Shapiro brought up, which is including zoomorphism in a story. So, you know, you would have a human with animal features, you know, like maybe a human with a tail or ears, he gave an example of a shapeshifter dog who could become human and vice versa. And a lot of people like that idea and brought up the Netflix series of Sweet Tooth.
Oh, yeah.
Which are some children who, I haven't watched it, but I've seen the trailer. So some children who were born with some animal-like features to allow them to survive in a degrading modern world, physical world. So do you have thoughts of whether these same concepts might apply in the same sort of framework, might apply to sort of flipping things around that way? Or if that might do some of these things about being responsible with non-human animals and how they're represented?
Yeah, sorry. I just quickly, and then Jenny can speak to this too, but I have thought about that a lot. And the concept that I like about those examples, such as Sweet Tooth, is flipping the hierarchy. So when I started really diving into the evidence of advanced cognitive behavior in animals and the advanced sociology that exists with animals in their own environment and how much we don't know about how sophisticated they are, that's something that I personally have been mulling over in my mind for a long time now. And I think that what's interesting about that is, you know, there's this, and Jenny, I'm sure you could speak to this better than me, but this concept that human beings have been at the top of that hierarchy as far as power is concerned and all that. And so the idea that it would reverse and that animal qualities are, albeit better than a lot of human qualities, I think is a very exciting idea. And I really enjoy that imaginary idea that we can take on animal characteristics and become better humans, essentially.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for those comments. I thought that's really interesting, and no, not at the focus of our project, but definitely something to think about. I think when we kind of developed this framework and we were like, you know, what are the ways in which this could maybe be used? And for us, it was more, you know, this is just a conversation starter. What we've seen when we've shared some of these ideas over the past year with folks is that it does just that, right? It starts these conversations that are really interesting and takes it way further than what we imagined it. And that's truly what the goal is. And I'll just circle back to kind of my original kind of opening for the talk was that, you know, I just see such value in these interdisciplinary conversations because, I mean, you know, if we're just sticking in our bubble of our own discipline, I think we're not tapping into these more interesting applications. And so I would encourage, you know, us all to maybe do that more. I've certainly grown as a sociologist through this collaboration. And as Melissa said, she's grown as an artist. Like, it's just really, really cool to watch. So yeah, I appreciate all that feedback.
So we only have 5 minutes left, but there's 2 questions left to get to. One is mine and one is in the chat. So I'm going to give them both to you and let you choose if you're going to answer them both or just take one on. One from Jill, I think, is really important. So you've talked about how anthropomorphism can be irresponsible. And Jill's question really speaks to this. She says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on representations of animals who are farmed for consumption and how that relates to cognitive dissonance in children. So how does this irresponsible anthropomorphism allow children to, have a lack of empathy for the animals who we use? And then my question, if you could just tell us what you're up to next, or put in the chat where we can find your work, Melissa, or see more things about this project, that would be really great to have that information. And if we don't have time for that, you can email it to me and I will post it when we post up the video.
I may jump in with the, yeah, it's an important point and one we didn't really have time to dive into. When we say that kind of this homage should be paid to actual lived experiences of animals, I mean, the reality that most of us center our work on is that these are systems of power and oppression, and that quote unquote actual lived experiences of animals in today's modern societies are often wrapped up in violence. And so how do we grapple with that? And I'm not going to claim that I have full answers for that. And I'm not going to claim that responsible anthropomorphism as a concept can maybe help address or eradicate those systems of power. But I do think, again, it's a conversation starter. If we start having conversations about quote unquote responsibility to a non-human animal's actual lived experiences in something like an art program, where it's discussed in the same way that gender and race, sexuality are discussed, as kind of paying tribute to human lived experiences, then, I mean, for me, I would hope that it would evolve into those more critical questions of, well, how are we using animals? You know, do I illustrate a story about a farm, and in what way could I illustrate that and apply this framework of attending to the animal themselves? For instance, if they're, I mean, I'm thinking of some stories in my mind right now of like attending to that idea that this is an unwanted situation from their perspective, that this is violence, this is oppression. I'd like to see the concept kind of being applied in those ways too. But I think it just simply starts with, we need to get it in the curriculum, right? We need to get it incorporated into class discussions in art schools. Melissa?
Yeah, yes, I echo everything you just said. And for me personally, going through the creation of, and just to be clear, there was sort of an evolution for me and myself. So the Hound Dog and Frog book was the first, Wallace the Whales was the second, and then the cognitive behavior illustrated stories was the third. And so I myself went through a very philosophical and life-changing experience as I personally tried to deconstruct all of this and try to create my personal art in a different way. And throughout the process, I became a vegetarian, and I don't even like to eat eggs anymore, so it affected me on a very personal level. And studying the behavior of animals in their own environments and interviewing people who work with animals and the issues they have with conservation and protecting these animals that are unwanted. It's a really it's a little bit overwhelming to think of how can we modify this situation and what can we do. And I guess right now, I feel the only thing we can do is just, like Jenny said, is start the conversation and try and figure out how to move forward from here. And I'm excited at the prospects of what other people might come up with and where this conversation will go and what it will lead to, I think is just very exciting. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Melissa and Jenny, I want to thank you so much for starting this conversation and sharing your time with us and getting this conversation going and doing all the work that you did to do all this background work. So many of us, we all were children. So many of us have children, and so many of us are doing this work. If you saw in the chat where everyone's coming from, there are a lot of people working in academia, working in art, and some of us have children in our lives too. So I'm sure that this is going to resonate with us as time goes on, and we'll keep thinking about it. So you might be getting some emails from some people out in the audience. Thank you to everyone who came in the audience. I really appreciate your time. I'll email you when a recording of this is available. So with that, I will say goodbye, and we will be sending out an email through ASI and through the Animals and Society section of ASA with more information on our panelists next month. We don't have that quite put together yet, but you'll be getting an email about that within probably about a week. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.